It's now time for our keynote speaker for the day, and we're very pleased to have with us today Lucinda Hartley. Lucinda is a global thought leader in urban development. And I'm going to have to put my glasses on now because I have to read carefully her list of accomplishments. She sits on the Youth Advisory Board of UN Habitat, the Steering Committee of the UN World Urban Campaign, and the Global Placemaking Leadership Council. She's steered over 30 renewal projects in Australia and has worked with various communities in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam and Cambodia. Please would you welcome the Chief Executive of the award-winning CoDesign studio, Lucinda Hartley.
Thanks very much for having me here today. And for a landscape architect, housing's an interesting subject. But I think actually when we look at our neighbourhoods and environments, that there is a huge connection between the way that we plan and design communities and housing. Today, I really want to talk about some of the challenges around housing in an environment which we've heard just now from Warwick so articulately, that is rapidly changing. At CoDesign Studio, we look at how we can make the most of infrastructure and how we can repurpose underutilised and underfunctioning spaces for places that will deliver social benefit. And the key mechanism for that is by mobilising some of the existing resources in communities to contribute and co-contribute to making those places. So balance of place and for people. But why I think this is an interesting subject is typically when we're talking about residential development, we tend to put infrastructure first and hope that that will establish an inclusive community. But what would it look like if we put people first as the driver in infrastructure? I'm perhaps what you might call a city tragic. I designed my first cities on a computer that looked something like this, on a computer game called SimCity that many of you would have played. And as a 7-year-old, I had this vision for a city that was a giant park. Then there were clusters of houses around, and each of those had their own park as well. I never planned any industrial, commercial, road infrastructure, anything like that. That sort of seemed like unnecessary details. And then was always confused as to why the statistics in my city had high crime rates, high affordability, unaffordability, the worldview of a 7-year-old perhaps. 25 years later, I'm still designing computers and still designing cities and still looking at a computer a lot of the time. But what I think is the interesting challenge is in that time period, which is just 25 years, how much the world's cities have changed. And I think these slides from NASA show it so well, that the challenge of urbanisation that we're facing, and it's all over the world, whether it's Burkina Faso, Dubai, and we'll just watch one more of these because I think they're really fun to see the changes that's happening worldwide. And the major growth around that is in housing, and how are we going to house the future of cities. So today we're talking about affordability and sustainability, quality, but also livability. And it's a particularly relevant question when you look, I'm from Melbourne, we're predicting a housing increase in the next 30 years of 30%, not as much as Auckland is predicting, around 50%. And globally, the statistics are the same, between 40 and 50% urban increase. What does that look like in places like Auckland and Melbourne? There's Greenfield development, there's urban infill, and this is sort of the Coburg rail transit you can see in Melbourne, where there's predicted to be high density along that transit corridor into the way to the CBD. But none of those compare to the global challenge of informal settlements. If we think about where most of housing is occurring, UN Habitat predicts that by 2050, 1 in 3 people will live in a slum or informal settlement. So if you just look to your left and then to your right and just think that one of you might not have access to housing in just 30 or 40 years' time. Just to put in context the rate of informal settlement growth, there is about 1 million people globally moving into slums and in settlements every single week. That's a new Adelaide, a new Copenhagen, 3/4 of Auckland every single week between now and 2050. And the challenge of that housing on a global scale is extraordinary. Having said that, I'm not going to focus on this major topic today, and I do want to talk about some more grounded issues in places like Melbourne and Auckland, but I think we must acknowledge when we're talking about challenges of housing, this is a global problem and has a lot of different faces. I see that there are three, just having described those three different trends in, I guess, global housing growth on the fringe, urban infill and informal settlements. And the point I want to make there is if you look at the first two, growth on the fringe and urban infill, those are largely policy and planning-driven growth mechanisms. Informal settlements are a community-driven growth mechanism that are exceeding and growing beyond planning. Both have major challenges. And so the point is that if we can sort of develop a housing mechanism that somehow combines the wisdom of planning and policy with community leadership, then perhaps we can have a model of growth that works for everyone. When we look at the major challenges for livability in cities, there are a lot of things that you'd think of. You might just want to turn to the person next to you just for 10 seconds and just think about what you think are some of the major challenges for livability in places like Melbourne and Auckland. Just an awkward moment for you to meet someone you haven't met yet today. All right, I'm sure you've come up with a lot of them, and if this was a workshop scenario, we would get you to throw those ideas out and think about them, which is probably not the purpose of this presentation today. But I always like to acknowledge who's in the room, and talking to the person next to you is a good way to do that. I think when we think about challenges of livability, there are often two categories of the environmental and the social, and also a lot of indicators and a lot of different studies that measure livability or look at trying to creating and measuring livability. On the one hand, there's the environmental rating, and The Economist, perhaps the most famous of the livability strategies, looks at indicators like infrastructure, technology, risk, goods and services. Cities like Melbourne and Auckland do pretty well on those in the top 10. I actually think that Melburnians would happy to be 99th so long as Sydney was 100th on that list. That's the only real indicator that we're looking at. But curiously, if you look, the Economist Intelligence Unit has also done what they call a spatially adjusted livability mechanism, using those livability indicators that I just mentioned, but in addition looking at sprawl, connectivity, social inclusion, green space and cultural assets. And Melbourne doesn't even make the top 20. So I think when we look at where the challenge lies, we're doing quite well on environmental, we're doing quite well on technology. And I think with the expertise in this room, we would acknowledge that we in fact have so much of the technology, so much of the environmental knowledge that we need to make these transitions. But why isn't it happening? And I would argue that that's because we don't yet have the social mechanisms or the behaviour change needed at a community level to really drive that. So the question really that I want to talk about today is that how can we ensure residential development is socially sustainable? But not just that, how can we make it happen faster? Because we can't continue in our business as usual model because there just isn't time. People are moving to the city just too fast. Jamie Lerner, who you may know, a globally renowned urbanist and former mayor of Curitiba in Brazil. He was the key thought leader behind the integrated bus rapid transit system that's now been rolled out in 150 cities. But he talks about fundamentally two things as being required to create rapid urban change and livability. And those are good design and co-responsibility. Firstly, good design, and I think we would acknowledge that is a key critical factor. But the challenge is when we only look at design, or if we look at design and technology as the answer, it's also quite a limiting solution. Globally, around 1.4% of people are built environment experts, which is a very small percentage of people making a lot of decisions about how we live. So that's essentially saying that we've got Alex and perhaps half of Lee here making all the decisions about how our cities are designed and planned. Now, there is a role and a function for expertise, but perhaps we've got that out of kilter with the proportion of people living in cities. The expert-led approach leads to the sort of expression of the planned city that I mentioned before, things like growth on the fringe, infill development. Planned cities tend to focus on infrastructure solutions. Now, we need infrastructure, and I have absolutely no argument that that is a core part of city growth, but the challenge is that it's slow, it's less responsive to change, and it's defined by quite a small core group of people. On the other hand, we have community, or a sense of having shared solutions and co-responsibility. And if we look at what that might look like, is more of an adaptive city. We've got an adaptive city in terms of flexible public spaces that can change with different seasons and as communities change. Interestingly, we're now in a scenario where through smartphone technology, every home can be a hotel, every car can be a taxi. That we've actually got technology as an enabler to make us and allow us to get the most out of our existing infrastructure without any physical changes at all. And it can change really rapidly and fast. So in terms of the adaptive city, tends to focus on people solutions and people-to-people connections. The advantage is that it's fast, it's flexible and defined by communities. I don't advocate for one or other of those solutions, but that we need both, and that we too heavily err on the design-led scenario. Andreas Duani, one of the world's leading thinkers on urbanism, you've probably read and at least been influenced by some of his strategies around smart growth, neighbourhood design. Certainly it's his philosophy that's driven a lot of the definition of growth area communities in the US and Australia. But he's recently come out and said the future isn't about town development. The future isn't about strategy. The future is lean, guerrilla, incremental, vernacular, tactical. And the reason that he's saying that is because we're facing a scenario where growth is so fast that our traditional mechanisms just can't keep up. That to a degree we need the traditional mechanisms, we need them for railways, we need them for larger scale planning, we need them for sewer and other infrastructure. But in between, there is a place where we need to open up that conversation to grow faster. And to put another way, I think if we look at cities being made up of essentially, in a very most basic rudimentary format, three things of being people, people in places, and some sort of connecting mechanism, often a local government, it could be on a site-by-site context, a community group, a property developer, that traditionally when we look about how we're going to go about creating change in a city, this is the predominant pathway. Even the night before I came here, I was at a local council planning meeting trying to get the developer next door to my house to include more ESD principles in their design. And it's a very slow and quite difficult process as a resident to do that. We need that pathway, but the conversation fundamentally that we're talking about is this one. How can we actually enable citizens to be co-creators of the city, and how can we connect and enable people to really transform places? Let's look at an example of that just quickly. And this is I'm just going to get some water, excuse me. This is a development in Rotterdam that we worked on with a group called ELOS Institute, a Brazilian architectural and community development organisation. This is a social housing building around 20, 30 years old. And we were looking there at a number of the challenges that were facing that community around access to open space. And this area in the middle, as you can see, is highly underutilised, but was also a real problem area in the community for antisocial behaviour. So when we were looking at how we would improve that space, instead of beginning with the physical landscape and the site analysis, although we did that too, we actually began with the residents. We started to map what talents, skills, ideas and resources that they might be able to bring to that project. How could they contribute? What would they like to see? And not just in terms of their ideas and feedback, but in terms of how they actually wanted to get their hands dirty making that space. We then worked over a few weeks in sort of a collaborative design process with the local government, with residents and with a number of volunteer designers. And then we did something that I think is quite interesting, is that in 2 weeks we built a prototype. So with no additional funding, the materials, the ideas for this space were entirely sourced from the community, and we're talking about a low-income public housing community. And we built a park not a permanent park, but a park. And this process had a dramatic influence on the way that that community interacted with their space, because not only did they have increased use, but they had the capacity that could say that, you know, I built that I was involved in creating that space. There's now a conversation around this development that's looking at permanent infrastructure for that park. But that conversation's really easy because the community relationships and mechanisms are already in place. And I think what's interesting again about this is this was done in 2 weeks. It was done with no additional funding, and it was done based on leveraging the ideas of the people who lived there. So it really built the sort of social sustainability that was required to then drive a long-term solution. If we look at some learnings from that case study and how that might relate to development of housing in neighbourhoods, I want to talk about perhaps 3 things. Excuse the yellow, that's quite difficult to read. One is that we can do more with less. That if we're talking about fitting an extra 3 billion people globally in cities, that's not going to mean an extra 3 billion housing units. That's going to mean doing more with what we've got. That means making not only more housing, but making the most of the public spaces that we have, so that if we do have increased density, that there are ways that that can be used better, just like in the example in Rotterdam, making the most of that park. The second thing is we can put people first, that perhaps there is an untapped resource in cities, in local communities, that not everything needs to be externally funded, that while there needs to be a degree of that resource can be matched, leveraged with community support to co-create the city. Now, if that sounds like an abstract concept, I think a really great parallel is looking at the tech startup industry and the software industry, which has had globally massive expansion over the past 10 or 20 years. And it hasn't been done by a series of policies. It hasn't been done by, I guess, senior software developers coming up with large-scale strategies. It's been done by small groups of predominantly young people in garages thinking about how they would mobilise local capacity to create change. They've come up with, instead of large strategies, they've come up with small replicable products. They've tested and prototyped and constantly renewing and changing those products. It's generally crowdsourced. It's opening up the conversation rather than narrowing it down, and it's predominantly youth-led. If we take that approach and apply it to the built environment, I think we offer ourselves a whole range of opportunities in terms of the processes and mechanisms that we have for delivering change by putting people first. The third thing is looking at that in the context of urban development is small changes. That we do need the larger infrastructure in a lot of ways, but a lot of the solutions that we do have can be incremental, they can be adaptive. This has been coined tactical urbanism, perhaps a term that you've come across. And it's about short-term action to drive long-term change. I like this example in the middle where a bunch of residents really wanted a bike lane. The answer was no, so they just went out one day and painted one, which is a little bit of guerrilla activity. But in fact, by doing that and by setting that example, their council then did actually look at building a bike lane. So if they just had the conversation and stopped there, not much would happen. But by showing a temporary change, a test, a quick intervention, they were actually able to get the solution that they wanted to see, and in a more collaborative way. Bringing those things of doing more with less, putting people first, and small changes into the context of housing. I want to look at some of the challenges around housing in Melbourne. I guess similar in some ways to Auckland with the housing strategy and unitary plan. Melbourne has just been through a 3-year planning process with Plan Melbourne, which was released in May this year, with mixed results for housing. This article from the Age newspaper last weekend probably sums up the core focus of the strategy, which is locking up our suburbs. That while this plan tried very genuinely to be responsive to what communities were saying, but the mechanism in which that was done meant that the not in my backyard syndrome prevailed, so that in fact the number one objective of Plan Melbourne is to protect the suburbs. Now, in a city that's got to accommodate another 1.6 million people in the next 30 years, and the number one objective is to not allow the suburbs to change, that is a very, very difficult strategy to deliver on. Basically what it looks like then is that there are only really two options for growth. One is high density infill, and there is around 6 or 7% of the land area in Melbourne that's been designated for high density residential. I fortunately live in one of those zones, which is why I'm having arguments with the developer next door to get some really good quality density. And the only other alternative is land release on the fringe. And in between, for the last 20 years, it's been possible to develop multi-unit developments, to do small apartment blocks in suburbs. No longer. You've now only got those choices of high density along railway corridors or growth on the fringe. Now, I have personal views about that's perhaps not the most sustainable way to generate the capacity that we need in the cities. But then on a social sustainability aspect, there are other challenges there. Urban Infill, a recent report, Living High, Living Healthy, produced by the Australian Housing Research Institute, looked at social inclusion in high-density residential. Now, I support high-density residential, but we do need to think about some of the social indicators. Those apartment blocks had much higher rates of social exclusion than mid-rise or townhouse development. I think Rob Adams, who's the senior urbanist at City of Melbourne and also speaks globally around these topics, he's been influential in increasing residential density in Melbourne CBD, hugely successful strategy, but he's worried about this plan in the sense that the future of Melbourne CBD could just be like Hong Kong without the beauty if we don't think carefully about how the quality of that high density and how we create it. The other extreme is that we've got greenfield growth areas. There are over 150 greenfield growth areas going through the precinct structure plan development process in Melbourne at the moment. So a lot of growth, and there's probably going to be more released. The urban growth boundary was meant to be the final one, but based on this Plan Melbourne strategy, we almost have no choice but to extend further. The challenge here, if we look at the what's called the Vampire Index, which is a really interesting name, but it looks at vulnerability and community vulnerability across a range of indicators, including car reliance, how vulnerable people are to changing oil prices, connectivity and social exclusion. We can see these graphs are just between 2001 and 2006, how essentially we are building in social isolation on the fringe. How that's only getting more extreme by having more growth without the infrastructure that's been put in place in time. Again, there are concerns about health crisis there. This is again from the Age back in 2012, but this family to travel to the nearest pool took them an hour and a half on the bus. So some challenges around public health in the way that some of these communities have been planned. So then what can we do? What can we do using do more with less, putting people first, and small changes? And let's just look at those both, and I want to show a couple of case studies from perhaps some different ways that that's being tackled and that we as a studio are looking at tackling that. One is urban infill. I think the challenge here is that we need to do more. We need to make the most of the underutilised assets, but fundamentally leveraging community support and being flexible. This example is Dodd Street. It's in South Bank in Melbourne. If you know Melbourne, South Bank's one of the highest density populated areas in Australia. It's got a population density equivalent to Hong Kong, just in that small little precinct. The challenge of that is that there isn't a lot of public open space. It's quite near the major parks and the Botanic Gardens, but there just aren't those third places or small intimate parks, places that you would go to build community. So what we looked at doing with Arts Victoria and City of Melbourne was finding ways that we might be able to increase that. And one of the highlighted areas was this red line in the middle, which is Dodd Street. It's a partially blocked off street that services the Victorian College of the Arts. But basically, during the week, it's used for about 20 to 30 car parking spaces, and it isn't actually used as a through road. So it's quite underutilised as a road, and it offers a lot of potential benefit to be a community space. But when anyone, whether you're talking to local traders, universities, anyone talking about closing roads, reducing car parking is a very challenging issue and one that people get quite worried about. So instead of developing a strategy, although we were doing that in the background, what we did is we just shut it for a week and see what happened. We very, very cheaply, as you can see, rolled out offcuts of AstroTurf. We did this in 2 iterations. We did actually a 1-day closure initially, and then we did a 1-week closure. In the first 1-week closure, we moved our office down there for a day. It was about creating a disruptive change to start to create that community conversation. Some art students enjoying the Melbourne winter sun. So that first day was really about trying to get different ideas, and we had everyone from the CEO of the ABC to senior executives from Arts Victoria, art students and local residents sitting down together around that sandpit or eating a cupcake and talking about what the future of that street would be. And I would argue that it would be very, very difficult to get that calibre of people, the number of people and that kind of conversation in any traditional town hall meeting. So as a preliminary sort of engagement mechanism, that was very effective. What we learned from that first trial is that we actually did a couple of things wrong. Where that sandpit and chairs are is actually the informal bike thoroughfare that we disrupted quite substantially for that day. Other things that we learned is that the site's really windy, quite unpleasant in some ways, needs some shelter, and the predominant thing that people were telling us is that there just isn't access to cheap eateries and food. There's a very high-end eateries in the arts precinct, but for poor arts students, they just wanted somewhere cheap to get coffee or to get lunch. So in the second trial, we took that on board. We built these very simple sort of platforms out of pallets. We took care to make sure that there were sort of places that you could sit down that was sheltered. We kept the bike lanes clear, and you can't see it, but we did actually chalk them out so that it was really clear that the bike transport was still a priority in this closure. Then we formed a relationship with some local food vans, and we had them down there for the week. And it was an opportunity for them to actually test a new market and to see whether those students and the general area that would support perhaps a small cafe, or perhaps they could come there every Friday or something like that. So the feedback that we had from that directly informed a long-term strategy for Arts Victoria. So these interventions were short-term, but they gathered a huge amount of evidence. They also built people's support in a really positive way about reducing car parking and access that's now led to a permanent plan for that park. So the immediate outcomes have been that the process of using that road has been de-risked. Doing anything on a public road is quite complicated, and I'm sure it's the same here. For Arts Victoria, they're now starting to, in the interim, while this park is in planning, starting to use that roadway space for performances and other student activities. And I guess we created a template or a mechanism for them to be able to do that. And that life in the underutilised space is starting to build a new life around that street. It also had new social capital, senior execs from Arts Victoria, perhaps for the first time being face-to-face with the students. We had really fast learning by using a trial and an iterative approach. We didn't need to wait 6 months for feedback. We could just set up for a week and we had very immediate feedback. But the challenges were still around this kind of a process, perhaps an unusual one for City of Melbourne, navigating the permits, insurances and the risk management to even do it in the first place. We had to be quite creative, but I think we now have set a precedent so that Arts Victoria can take that on. A different example, again on an infill example, is a vacant car parking space in Collingwood. This is just near our office. And we hosted the School of Life pop-up space for 3 months over last summer. You may be familiar with the School of Life. It's the philosopher Alan Borton out of London runs a school, a program on how to be more creative, how to think less about money, all kinds of different programs. They wanted to bring it to Melbourne, weren't sure whether it would work. At the same time, there was a property developer who owned this car park and sort of there's the shell of a warehouse on that site. And they're quite a forward-thinking developer. They've built some of the greenest buildings in Melbourne. They were interested to look at having a permanent community space on the ground floor of their building. But again, they didn't just want to set up shop and just hope that it would be used. They wanted to see whether there was actually any support for that kind of community space. So this trial, if you like, had two purposes for the School of Life and for the property developer. We had a very low budget, under $10,000 for the construction of it. We went through a very sophisticated drawing process with our local stakeholders. We did actually produce slightly better drawings than that, but only slightly. Then we worked to promote the project, and we did that by just starting work. It's on private land, so I guess the permit issues were different from the Dodd Street example. But by just, we sourced a whole lot of recycled materials. We had volunteers out on site and some of our staff. And during that process, through a series of weekend working bees, there was over 40 people from the local area, just curious, just came down to see what was going on. There are really interesting stories of people like Matt, who's a carpenter who lives in the area, pulled up in his van one day and said, you know, what are you doing? This sounds fantastic. I live around the corner. camera. We're like, we love you. You've got a power saw and a van full of tools. So people came down and we built this space together. This is the warehouse area. So this was the sort of final result. Again, we had a food van came down and operated a bar on the weekends. There was an outdoor cafe using very simple materials. And in fact, I think some of the best precedents of this style of work are in Christchurch, and you would be familiar with some of them. Our objective here was looking at, yes, a quick win for the space, how we could really quickly transform it, but also proving some longer-term concept ideas. This is the internal space, which they were calling a bibliotherapy space, which I think is just a hipster word for a library or bookshop, perhaps, and an internal workshop area. So very successful, complete sellout program for the School of Life, and they've recently opened their permanent facility in Bourke Street. But I think beyond that, it created the momentum that's needed for the developer to have that degree of comfort that they could establish a community space and that there would be support for it. It created a large volunteer network. It was a very low-cost experiment that created a lot of social value and built momentum. But of course, with the low cost, there's also a very huge challenge of working on a small budget. I really like the quote again by Jamie Lerner, who says that, if you want real innovation, take a zero off your budget. So it forces people to think about what resources and assets they might be able to bring to the project. One last example on urban infill. This is looking at the North Richmond housing estate, which is a 20-storey sort of Le Corbusier style 1960s public housing development, which has got a whole lot of challenges of its own, which I won't go into. But what we were looking at is the foyers of these buildings. The foyers are a really interesting space because in many ways, when you live in a high-rise like this, the foyer is the entry to your home. But the foyers currently are completely plagued with signs of don't do this, put this here, and there's meant to be community notice boards, but it's a very unwelcoming place. And in fact, a lot of our team had never even been into these foyers, and I think part of that is just this hostile sort of approach. So again, working on a shoestring budget, we were looking at how we could upgrade these foyers. I think renovation would probably be a stretch. We were really just looking at doing a short-term lift to build the community support to then generate a longer-term renovation. So again, beginning by mobilising the community to see sort of what kinds of ideas they would like to contribute, how they might like to be involved. And then we did a series of weekend working bees to look at really low-cost ways that we could improve it. Each of the foyers, and there are 4 of them, had a different design outcome, and they were all designed in such a way that they were pieces put together so that different people could create a different piece of it and feel that they had some part of that foyer. This particular foyer, I think, is really interesting. There's sort of a weaving installation, if you like, and a lot of the children really interested to make these, but then they also wanted to take them home, so then we had to make 2, which was a challenge at first, but then there's actually a really nice thing that now they've got something that's in the foyer and they've also got one in their home, and there's perhaps a bit more connection. There's those woven things. So some interesting outcomes from this project is as a much higher level of engagement than the Department of Housing had previously had on some of the infrastructure upgrading that they've done there, and from a different group of people. They've got housing committees and community reference groups, but it's the usual suspects always attending. This, because we were actively, painting and renovating the foyers of these buildings where people were walking in and out every day, it created a really different kind of experience. But I think probably the key outcome from this is this model of weekend working bees and being very action-oriented has created a new model for Department of Housing, and they're rolling it out to floor levels, to looking at how they could then look at the lift areas and allowing people to have perhaps a greater degree of control. Like, do their doors have to be beige? Maybe it wouldn't be the end of the world if they painted a different colour. Looking at some different changes that could be made. Again, there was high levels of participation. But the challenge is perhaps this project is still short-term. It had a really great, I think, long-term social capital outcome, but this really needs to be followed through with a longer-term renovation, which is planned, and again, working on a small budget. I guess if we were to summarise the process of those 3 projects, they all probably identify some similar principles of Engagement, or perhaps you might even say mobilisation, it's about getting the right people to the table. I think most people that you and I would work with in our roles are really genuinely interested to see a better future for their house, their neighbourhood, their city, but actually getting them involved can be a challenge. So looking at different ways of doing that in engagement. The second thing is very, very action-oriented and making and evaluating that change. So doing something quickly, even if it's just a trial, so that, one, that you don't lose interest, but also so that you can actually test and build the evidence to support what you're doing. A lot of what we design is based on a series of assumptions that we've never tested. We might spend $1 million on something that we've never tested. And in this way, we can do very low-cost trials to build that evidence and plan with greater certainty. But then the evaluation is really important. This isn't about pop-up spaces. This isn't about having fun with milk crates, although we do have fun with milk crates. It's about building evidence and then using that to inform the plan. Taking that model, I guess, into a really different context in Greenfield areas, and we are working on with some, although they're partway through, and I'm probably not at a point with where I can publicly share the full story, but we'll be able to in a few months' time. But in terms of the principles, looking at that, it's really about, and I'm sure that there are very similar challenges here, that acknowledging that there are going to be 150 new developments in Melbourne in the next 10 years. Whether or not I think that's the best urban strategy is probably an aside, to the point that those ones at least are going to happen. Huge issues around social isolation and inclusion in those areas. A very interesting report by John and Janet Stanley looked at some of the issues around social isolation, connectivity and social infrastructure with a really direct correlation, and some of the vulnerability maps that I showed earlier indicate that. So what are some small ways? Yes, there are large-scale challenges that we need to address there, but what are small things that we can do right now to start to look at some of those challenges? And one is having the facilities and assets there from day one, not year 3, not year 5, but day one. And that can be done, again, with temporary, low-cost prototypes. Perhaps you don't have to build the permanent community centre, but you could have a shipping container there from day one. And looking at how we can use those temporary spaces as a mechanism to start to build that social capital, which will create that longer-term certainty. And also in terms of we can use that initial and early engagement to drive some of the longer-term changes, because perhaps not all the decisions would have been made up front. There might be that 90% of the area was predetermined. There might be a remaining 10%, whether it's a park or the way that the retail is developed, and that the community could actually have an influence on that. Because often when we're designing greenfield developments, we're not sure who we're planning for. But by involving them early, we can actually design for real people. I think we've got people who sort of, in some ways, are the pioneers and who are moving into new areas. And what's interesting about greenfield sites that is different from infill is that people are making a very conscious choice to move somewhere else, often moving away from their families, often moving into a brand new community, interested to know new people. Things people have told us is that they have made that choice to be there, but they think it'll be really great in 5 years' time. They're just really biding their time. They're looking forward to parks and other infrastructure being there, which just isn't quite there yet. So ways that we can do that: we can look at temporary infrastructure to generate local activity. We can engage with buyers early, before they move in, even to give them a different influence in the neighbourhood, but also from a marketability perspective. A community that has activity for day one is much more attractive than a community where there's not going to be much there till year 3 or year 5. We can test ideas so that when you are delivering on the park, on the playground, whatever it is, there is some certainty that's been tested. And some different ways that might look like are things like temporary community centres, bike share programs, movie nights, community gardens. There's really interesting pop-up dismountable playgrounds, book exchanges and other different activities. Again, the process is the same. Engagement might look a little bit different. That's often online because you might not know exactly who people are. Testing, evaluating and planning. Now finally, because this has been a lot of talks this morning and this is my last point, but I do want to touch just briefly on some of the challenges of informalism before we close, because while I think it's not the subject so much of this forum, it's very important to acknowledge. I'm going to look at one case study that we've worked on. I think the challenges are similar in some ways with informal settlements. It's about making the most of underutilised spaces, harnessing community capacity, and looking at flexible changes. These environments are already, fortunately, very flexible. In some places it's about putting some more permanent infrastructure in, and enterprise being a key driver. I want to look at a community that we worked with on the Tonle Sap up near Siem Reap in Cambodia. A number of you might have been to the Angkor Wat area or even seen these communities, about 4,000 families who live floating on the river. They're floating on the river because they don't have land, which means that they're poorest of the poor, typically Vietnamese migrants or descendants of Vietnamese migrants, so they've had more barriers to home ownership. So we were working with them around some issues around nutrition, because when you live floating on a lake and you don't have land and you also don't have money, access to fruit and vegetables is a really big challenge. And people are living off rice and fish at best, and there's nutrition, especially for children, is a really large problem. So we were looking at ways that we might be able to do to support that using floating rafts. Now, rafts are not a new concept. In fact, there'd been some NGOs in this area who donated rafts in the past, but they were made of bamboo, which is a relatively, in this area, expensive building material. And the first response that this community had when we moved in was, well, where's the bamboo? And you're like, well, we didn't bring any bamboo. We're not actually here to build it for you. But that sort of creates that perception. The problem with bamboo also is that because it's an expensive material, whenever there's a storm or other event, those materials become very quickly repurposed into patching up buildings, and the raft is no longer there and there's still nowhere to grow fruit and vegetables. So using the same process of trying to look at what resources that community had, in fact, the very same process that we worked on in Rotterdam, very different expression, but same process, looking at what materials we might have, what skills and resources people had, looked at things like empty drink bottles, 40-gallon drums, baskets that were readily available. Some pontoons were made with bamboo, and we established 6 trials over a 1-month period. So this was a process about enabling those local residents to come up with ideas that they had for flotation and for rafts, and for us just to be there to facilitate that process. We ran the trials over a 6-month period, and my colleague Kate was there recently to do an evaluation with very interesting results. So all 6 families had kept their raft in some format or another. 4 of those rafts were still used for vegetables. But the interesting thing is 8 other families had built their own rafts with no additional funding or support, and there were other families still who'd used some of the flotation mechanisms developed through this workshop to improve the flotation of their housing. So I guess the legacy that was left behind there wasn't really the raft or the product, but about the process of problem solving and identifying resources. And that same process is the one that I think is something where we can value add to our housing mechanisms in places like New Zealand and Australia, where we focus very heavily on providing the solution, less on building the capacity of the community to support that solution. I've already summarised those points. There are still challenges in all of these processes. The major one is, I think, perhaps a lack of entrepreneurial governance, and this was touched on this morning in different points about regulation. Sometimes regulation, which is meant to be there to support, actually inhibits. There is a sense of continuity that I think engagement shouldn't just be done at the visioning phase, but every phase of the project through to implementation. And scale. And sometimes it may seemingly be a disconnect between the global housing challenge and very small projects, or often temporary projects. But to that I would say this, if we want to build a house, we can build a house. But if we build a house and also build the capacity of the community to know how to create a change, then they are lifelong home builders. And that is going to create the scale that we need to see for the scale that we're facing. So do more with less, unleash human capacity. I think you've probably had enough words, which is why I'm skipping this. But I guess the quote that I want to end with, which is a favourite of mine from Margaret Mead, is that we think that the challenges are really large, but she said that we should never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world, because it's the only thing that ever has. Thanks for having me today.